For as long as she could remember, Elena carried a quiet certainty in her chest, a firm, almost unshakable belief that love, in its romantic, cinematic form, was an idea far more appealing than it was real, a soft illusion built for those who hadn't learned yet that people leave, that feelings fade, and that promises are just longer versions of not yet. She didn't speak about it often, because people didn't really like hearing that kind of honesty, especially not from a woman who smiled easily, laughed at the right moments, and dressed like she believed in flowers and poetry, but inside, she had trained her heart to keep a kind of emotional distance from everything that glittered, everything that came too close, everything that whispered permanence in a world where nothing ever stayed long enough to deserve the word. It wasn't bitterness that shaped this belief, nor some tragic heartbreak that left her hardened. It was more like erosion, the slow wearing away of trust by little things, broken plans, forgotten birthdays, messages unanswered for just long enough to sting, voices that once said always and eventually settled for sometimes. Over time, she simply learned to protect herself by expecting less, by giving just enough warmth to seem open, but never enough to be vulnerable. So when Lucas came into her life, confident, charming, and armed with all the right lines, she let him in, but only to a point. He was the kind of man who knew exactly how to make someone feel chosen, like they had been plucked out of a crowd for some secret, radiant reason, and while part of her wanted to believe in that glow, a deeper part of her stood with arms folded behind the curtain, waiting for the catch. And, inevitably, it came, not as betrayal, not even as cruelty, but as carelessness, as quiet neglect that crept in once the thrill wore off, once the certainty of having her made him forget that he still needed to see her. He didn't leave with drama. There were no shouting matches, no accusations, no final scene worthy of replays. He simply became someone else, slowly, indifferently, until one day she woke up and realized she was dating a man who wasn't looking at her anymore, even when his eyes were open. When she ended it, he didn't argue. He just nodded, as if they had both known for a while that this ending had been waiting in the walls, and all it needed was a voice to let it out. She didn't cry. She didn't fall apart. But something inside her shifted, not because she lost someone, but because she realized how little she had ever actually let herself want him, and how sad it was that even when she'd tried to open her heart, she'd only given enough to survive the exit. What she didn't expect was Julian. He had been there all along, not lurking, not longing, not waiting with quiet devotion, just existing, like the kind of presence you don't realize is consistent until you look back and find them quietly occupying space in your life. He was a friend, in the simplest and most unassuming sense of the word, the person who offered to help her move apartments without turning it into a favor, the person who remembered how she took her tea even when she changed it twice, the person who once stood next to her in the rain with a bag of groceries because her umbrella broke and he didn't think twice about it. He never flirted. He never asked questions that pressed too far. But he looked at her like he saw more than she let on, like he was aware that underneath the easy confidence was a fortress carefully designed to keep people from getting too close, and he didn't try to break it down, he just sat near it, sometimes leaning against the wall, saying nothing, waiting for the door to creak open on its own. It was after Lucas left that she noticed how often Julian had been showing up, not just physically, but emotionally, in quiet, irreplaceable ways. The texts asking if she got home safe, the casual voice notes that made her laugh when the silence in her apartment felt a little too sharp, the small, steady gestures that didn't shout "look at me" but whispered "I see you all the same." And when she finally asked him, half-jokingly, late at night, both of them on the edge of sleep and honesty, why he was always so kind to her, he just said, without hesitation, "Because you never ask for anything. And somehow, that makes me want to give you everything." She didn't respond that night. But her silence wasn't rejection. It was the sound of a belief beginning to fracture. It didn't happen in a single moment, not in some grand gesture or cinematic confrontation where realization crashes in all at once. Instead, it unfolded the way seasons shift, imperceptibly at first, a change in the light, the way the air feels at the edge of a morning, until suddenly, without fanfare or announcement, you look up and realize the leaves have turned gold, and nothing is quite the same as it was the week before. That's how it began for Elena, not with Julian saying something new, but with her finally listening to what had been there all along. He never pushed. That was the most disarming thing about him. He didn't linger in ways that demanded to be noticed, didn't show up under the pretense of checking in when what he really wanted was attention, didn't make her feel like she owed him something for the kindness he gave so freely. And because he didn't push, she didn't resist. Instead, she found herself drifting closer, not because she had to, not because he made her feel indebted, but because proximity to him felt like warmth, a kind that didn't burn or demand but wrapped itself around her slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a blanket placed across your shoulders when you hadn't realized you were cold. There was a moment, small and forgettable to anyone else, that shifted everything. She had come down with a fever, nothing dramatic, just a stubborn chill that kept her in bed for 2 days, disconnected from the world, drained and a little fragile. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't feel like being seen in that state. But on the evening of the second day, a knock came at her door, followed by Julian's voice, low, cautious, not assuming anything. He hadn't been told. He had just noticed the silence. And in his hands, soup, the kind she liked, the one he remembered she'd once called childish but comforting on a random winter afternoon. He didn't stay long. He didn't hover. He just placed the food on the kitchen counter, poured her a glass of water, and asked if she needed anything else. She shook her head, quietly overwhelmed, not by the gesture itself, but by how gently it had been delivered. No expectation. No explanation needed. Just care, offered like a fact of life. After he left, she sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket, holding the still warm bowl in her hands, and realized she was crying, not because she was sad, or in pain, but because something inside her had finally started to thaw, and that process, as gentle as it was, ached in ways she hadn't expected. In the weeks that followed, nothing big happened, no confessions, no romantic declarations, no orchestrated moments meant to sweep her off her feet. Instead, what happened was trust. Quiet, consistent, unshakable trust. The kind you don't always see forming because it builds itself out of small, repeated acts, showing up when it matters, remembering without being reminded, offering without keeping score. And the more time she spent with him, the more she realized how exhausting her previous idea of love had been, how much effort it had taken to make herself lovable in someone else's eyes, how often she had twisted and adjusted and silenced pieces of herself just to stay wanted. But with Julian, she wasn't being wanted, she was simply being seen, fully, without pretense. And that kind of seeing was harder to accept than she expected. There were nights she stayed awake wondering if it was real, if he was real, if the stillness she felt in his presence was simply calm or the eerie silence before another storm. But each time, those doubts faded, not because he erased them, but because he never fed them, never gave them the fuel that past lovers had unknowingly provided, missed calls, forgotten details, the casual cruelty of carelessness. Instead, he just kept showing up, not like a man trying to win something, but like someone who already had everything he needed and simply wanted her there, not to complete him, but to walk beside him. Eventually, there was a night, quiet and dim, with no particular reason to mark it, no holiday, no anniversary, not even a shared bottle of wine to blame the tenderness on, when they sat in her apartment and she said the words neither of them had dared to touch until then. Not with urgency, not with fear, just with the kind of calm that comes when something has already happened inside you, and all that remains is to finally name it. I used to think love was a trick, she said, eyes not on him but on her own, hands folded in her lap, something people convinced themselves they felt because they were lonely or bored or needed to be seen. I spent years believing that. And then, you. He didn't move. Didn't speak. But the way he looked at her made her feel more naked than if she'd been standing in front of him stripped of everything, not physically, but emotionally, because there was no defense left, no cynicism to hide behind. I don't know what this is supposed to look like, she said. I don't even know if I'm ready. But I know that every time you leave, something in me quiets down when I know you're coming back. And that, more than anything, was what she had never felt before, not the thrill of being desired, not the flutter of infatuation, but the calm certainty that someone's presence meant safety, not risk. Julian finally reached for her hand, and in that touch there was no claim, no drama, just the solid, wordless assurance of someone who had waited not for a yes, but for honesty. And she gave it. Not all at once, but enough to begin. Some people change what you believe in. Others change what you believe about yourself. But a rare few, they just stay. Until you no longer need belief at all. Only presence.